Officials travelled to Tehran for negotiations in October and November. A final round of negotiations took place in Muscat in February, resulting in this agreement. Our ambassador in Tehran, Simon Shercliffe, has also been in constant talks with Iranian ministers and senior officials, and I spoke to Minister Abdollahian in October to progress the talks. In December, I met Minister Badr, and I secured Oman's assistance in this important work. And in February, I held discussions with Minister Abdollahian again to drive the talks to a final conclusion. We will continue to push with partners to secure Morad's permanent release home, which is long overdue. And we will continue to support other British nationals in Iran who have asked for our help. We will work closely with our international partners to urge Iran to end its practice of unfair detention. It remains, and always has been, within Iran's gift to release any British national who's been unfairly detained. The agonies endured by Nazanin, Anousheh, Murad and their families must never happen again. Our efforts to settle the IMF debt have also reached their conclusion. After highly complex and exhaustive negotiations, the more than 40-year-old debt between the international military services and the Ministry of Defence of Iran has now been settled. As the House is aware, this debt relates to contracts signed with the Iranian Ministry of Defence in the 1970s. Following the revolution of 1979, these contracts could not be fulfilled. I pushed officials to be as creative as possible in finding a way to resolve this situation, and they have worked round the clock to find a viable payment route. We have considered and exhausted many options in the process, but I can tell the House we have found a way to make the payment in full in compliance with UK and international sanctions and global counter-terrorism financing and anti-money laundering regulations. A sum of £393.8 million has now been paid, which will only be available for humanitarian purposes. The terms remain confidential to both parties. We have long said we would find a solution to the IMF's debt. Now, thanks to the tireless work of our officials, we have found a way to do so. The repayment of the debt, in parallel with the release of our nationals, reflects steps taken by both the UK and Iran to resolve issues of serious disagreement between our two countries. We will continue to stand up for our interests, for the freedom and security of our nationals wherever they are, and for an end to arbitrary detention. But for now, to Nazanin and Anousheh, I am pleased that in just a few hours' time, we will be able to say, welcome home. I commend this statement to the House.
Senate Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of the statement. Mr. Speaker, for too long, the Iranian government have been depriving British nationals of their liberty to use them as political bargaining chips. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has been detained in Iran for almost 6 years. Anousheh Ashouri has faced the same fate for almost 5 years. The suffering they have endured during these years is unimaginable. The moments of laughter, joy and hope that they and their families have lost are irretrievable. The Iranian government is entirely to blame for these acts of cruelty. The whole House will be overjoyed that their detention has now come to an end, and that Nazanin and Ashouri can return to British soil to be reunited with their families, to take the breath of freedom once again. We must pay tribute to their tireless families who showed extraordinary strength, resilience and courage in the face of unimaginable ordeal. I also give credit to the member for Hampstead and Kilburn for all of her efforts over so many years, and to the member for Lewisham East for continuing to raise these issues, for their tireless work in campaigning to secure the freedom of their constituents. We join the government in thanking the government of Oman for their help. I also give credit to the tireless work of British officials, as well as the Foreign Secretary for her role in securing justice. She showed more skills in diplomacy than her bungling boss, who appeared to do more damage than help while he held her current post. There are serious lessons that need to be learned from this appalling episode. We need stronger international measures to combat the use of arbitrary detention as a political tool, to end hostage diplomacy, and we need a review of these cases. We need to understand what could have been done by the British government to secure releases sooner. I note that the Foreign Secretary says she stepped up these efforts over the last 6 months, and I give her credit for that. We welcome that. But we ask what efforts were not taken by her predecessors that could have been. A review must also consider what comments made by ministers indeed contributed to extended detention. It's also good news that Morad Tabaz had been released on furlough. Could the Foreign Secretary elaborate on the next steps to support his case? We note that there remain other British nationals still in detention seeking help from the British government. Can the Foreign Secretary update the House on the latest number and what efforts is in place to help them? Mr. Speaker, we welcome the government's parallel announcement that the IMF debt has been repaid. We have long called for the government to find a way to pay back that internationally recognised and legitimate debt. What guarantees have the government been given that the sum will only be used for humanitarian purposes? Today, though, let us focus on the main point of this statement. The whole House and the whole country can share in the triumph of welcoming Nazanin and Anousheh home.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
There have been years of efforts and some fantastic people in the Foreign Office, including the leaders of the Foreign Office and the Foreign Office team, who have worked tirelessly. What has changed in the last 6 months is we do have a new government in Iran. And I was able, when I went to New York in September and met Minister Abdollahian, to reset the relationship and be clear that we were serious about resolving the outstanding issues that Iran had, and they were clear they were serious about resolving the outstanding issues we had. And I do want to pay tribute to the fantastic Foreign Office officials who have been absolutely tenacious in travelling to Tehran and getting this done in what is a very difficult circumstance, because, as the Right Honourable Gentleman is aware, paying money to Iran with the intensive sanctions regime in place is not easy, even though this is very clearly a legitimate debt. And I can completely assure him that we do have humanitarian guarantees. What I can't do is go into the details, because that is confidential between the parties. But I have had this thoroughly checked out across government to ensure that we have those guarantees that it will be used for humanitarian purposes. On the subject of Morad Tabaz, who I spoke to at the end of last year when he was in prison, we have secured release for him on furlough, so he is now at home, and that was a very important point we were pressing with the Iranian government. I know from speaking to him that the conditions in prison were absolutely abhorrent and appalling, so he is now in better conditions. But of course, we will continue to work to get him home, as well as other detainees who do not want their names released in public. The other point I'd make about Mr. Tabaz is, of course, he is a tri-national with the US, so we do need to work with our US partners on this issue, and we are talking to him. But in the spirit of what he said about welcoming the families home, that should really be our focus today. They have been through an appalling ordeal. I can't imagine what it is like to be without my family, my mother, for so long. And we must give the families the privacy they deserve, and we must thank them for their tenacity through this appalling ordeal that should never happen to anyone.
Committee, Tom Tugendhat.
Mr. Speaker, I'm hugely grateful for the extraordinarily welcome news that my right honourable friend has brought to the House this afternoon. It is the most wonderful moment for many of us who've been campaigning, but particularly, and I pay huge tribute for the two honourable members opposite, for Hampstead and Kilburn and for Lewisham East, but also for our friend Anne Clwyd, who spent an awful lot of time campaigning for this as well when she was in this House. May I ask whether or not the government has been looking at some of the implications that happened when the last time a ransom payment was paid to the Iranian government, and that ransom payment was paid by the US government a number of years ago. About 6 months after they were paid, the Iranian government took another 6 American dual nationals hostage and merely started the whole process again. Sadly, furthermore, the money that was paid was then spent on murdering hundreds of thousands of Sunni Muslims in Syria. Can she assure us that that will not happen this time, that British citizens will be very carefully warned of the dangers they face in visiting Iran, and that none of this payment will end up in weapons and ammunition to kill Syrians?
Well, first, it's very important to note that these are two parallel issues in our bilateral relationship, namely settling the IMS debt, which is a legitimate debt that the UK government were due to pay, as well as settling the issue of the detainees. I am very clear that we need to work with our international partners to end the practice of arbitrary detention. In fact, we are joining a group with the Canadians and others to do just that. So we have a strong international response to the practice of arbitrary detention being used by countries to get their own way. So I completely agree with my honourable friend. We need to end this practice. We need to end this practice working with partners. It's a key point that we're discussing as part of the G7 Foreign Ministers track.
SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd also thank the Foreign Secretary for sight of the statement, and goodness, in a week when we could all be doing with a bit of good news, I was very glad to read it. The SNP shares the happiness at the release of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, Anousheh Ashouri and Murad Tahbad. We'd also pay tribute to their friends and their families and themselves for putting up with an intolerable situation. And this has been a long time coming, and I think there are lessons to learn, but I think the Foreign Secretary, her ministers and officials deserve their moment on this. This has been a great achievement, and I'm very glad to see that happen. And the news that the historic debt is going to be paid as humanitarian aid, well, I proposed that from this place on the 16th of November 2021, so I can hardly quibble that it's happened. I'm glad of the assurances that it will go to humanitarian purposes, and I'll take that on trust, which I think we're all entitled to do. But I've got two questions. The first is, how many dual nationals are in Iran in this situation? Because we're aware there's some, but we don't know how many specifically there are. And also what wider assessment there are of other dual nationals in this position elsewhere. And also I'd echo the concerns of the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee that there is a risk of moral hazard in this, where I think we're all agreed that this is historic debt that needed to be repaid. Others could take other lessons from this. And what assessment has been made of the risk of moral hazard to people, British citizens going to Iran, but also in other places of risk? And perhaps the Foreign Office guidance needs to be updated in those situations. I'd be grateful for an update on that as well. But congratulations. Thank you.
Well, on the honourable gentleman's first point, I'm afraid I can't comment on individual cases, and even to the extent of talking about the numbers of individual cases, I'm afraid I can't do that. The honourable gentleman is right that we do need to work against arbitrary detention. The best way to do that is part of an international compact. That's why we're addressing this issue at the G7. That's why I welcome the Canadians' leadership on the issue, and I've met my Canadian counterpart on several occasions and talked about how we move this forward to change the incentives. You know, what we need to do is fundamentally change the incentives for governments so there is not an incentive to behave in this way.
Jeremy Hunt.
Can I salute the leadership of the Foreign Secretary on this issue? As I know from my own experience, this is a fearsomely difficult diplomatic challenge, and it wouldn't have been solved without sustained personal interest right from the top, and she deserves great credit for that. Can I, most of all, though, commend the efforts of Richard Radcliffe, Nazanin's husband. His quiet courage, his humility, his total determination never wavered throughout 6 years of hell, and I think he was really the bravest person I met during my time as Foreign Secretary and an inspiration to many people. And can I ask the Foreign Secretary, is she inspired by the united Western response to the crisis in Ukraine? And is there something we can learn from that to unite as democratic countries to stamp out the vile practice of hostage-taking?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right about Richard Ratcliffe and the families of the detainees and the courage that they have shown in the face of appalling adversity, as well as those detained themselves who have really gone through incredible hardship and difficulty, and just not knowing what the future would look like. And I pay tribute to the work my right honourable friend did when he was Foreign Secretary, and the leadership he has also shown in his current role on this issue. He is completely right. You know, this is why we are working with allies like the Canadians on the issue of unfair detention, because we need to take a common stance. And the way we have worked together on Ukraine, on sanctions, on supplying defensive aid to Ukraine, shows that we can do this in other areas and really stand up for freedom and democracy and the rules-based international order, and change the fundamental incentives that regimes like this have in terms of the way they behave.
Janet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is really a day of celebration for the Anousheh family, and I think they will be so relieved when the plane hits the ground and both Nazanin and Ashouri are walking again on British soil. And as Anousheh's Member of Parliament, I am of course thrilled beyond belief for his release and for Nazanin. And I'm incredibly happy for Anousheh's wife, Sherry, for his children, Elika and Ariane, as well as for their families and friends. And today I spoke to Sherry. Indeed, I've been speaking to her yesterday as well. And she tells me that she has had several years of heartache and separation. And of course, all of this could have been avoided. It is right that the issue of the long-standing debt of approximately £400 million was addressed and returned by the British government to secure the freedom of our British citizens. And I do salute as well the Foreign Secretary for making the IMS debt her priority, and I thank her for that. But I would also like to say that it has been over 1,650 days since Anousheh was detained, and these are days of his life that cannot be returned to him. I would therefore like to ask the Right Honourable Member why it has taken so long for the government to secure Nazanin and Anousheh's release.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for her tireless campaigning on this issue, and I share her sense of anxiety, and there were some very anxious moments this afternoon as we waited for wheels up in Tehran as the plane departed, and we knew that finally our detainees and Nazanin and Anousheh would be returning back to the United Kingdom, and we're very much looking forward to welcoming them later on today. And I too have spoken to the family, to Sherry, and I know how hard it has been for the families, and the courage that they have shown over these very, very difficult years. What I will say about the process of securing the release of our detainees is the foreign secretaries, the Prime Minister, Foreign Office officials have worked tirelessly on this. There really is a very, very dedicated team at the Foreign Office. Last summer we saw a new government in place in Iran. It did give us an opportunity to start afresh on some of these issues, to look at new ways we could do things in terms of paying the IMS debt, and we have been able to deliver on this. But we have to remember that fundamentally it was the Iranian government who put these people in detention. And ultimately what we need to do, as many members across this House have been saying, is change the incentives on government, so taking detainees unfairly is not seen as something that is a proposition in the modern world. But I do pay tribute to Foreign Office officials who have worked tirelessly for years to make this happen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The daughter of Murad Tabaz is my constituent, and I would like to pay tribute to the Foreign Secretary and her team for all of her efforts. Can my right honourable friend assure me that she and her team will continue to work with the US in order to ensure that he may leave Iran? And can she tell me practically what being on furlough from prison entails?
The Tabaz family and I have spoken today. It is a very, very difficult situation. Morad Tabaz is, of course, a tri-national, US, UK and Iranian. and the Iranian government do treat him as being a US national as well as a UK national. We push very hard to get Morad out of prison, and I spoke to him when he was in prison, and he was in appalling conditions. And I'm pleased to say that I have been in touch today, and he is now back at his house with security in place, but he is back at his house with his family in Tehran. Now, we will continue to work to get him back home, and we will be working with our allies, including the United States, to make that happen. But I am pleased that we have been able to secure his release from prison and return home in Tehran.
Leila Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we've all been quite emotional today. Tears of joy, I hope, are going to be cried this evening. And to think that Richard Ratcliffe will be able to welcome Nazanin, and she might even put Gabriella to bed or even take her to school tomorrow for the first time. What a thought. The £400 million that has been paid as the legitimate debt, we'd been told for a long time was not linked. Well, I'm glad that it's been paid, and I'm glad that in any way it's led to their release. What I asked the Foreign Secretary is, that's not an insignificant sum in the context of ODA spend. Can she assure that this not going to count towards our ODA spend and comes over on top of other planned spending?
Well, I can assure the Honourable Lady that this comes from the Ministry of Defence. So the Ministry of Defence, it's a long-standing debt that the Ministry of Defence have paid in accordance with the international rules, including ensuring that this money is going to be spent on humanitarian purposes. And I am pleased that Richard and Gabriella, who are in the gallery today, will be able to see Nazanin again this evening. And I pay tribute to Richard and Gabriella for their fortitude in such appalling circumstances.
Mr. Speaker, at a time when every day we're reminded of the amazing resilience of a country, this is a great moment to be reminded of the resilience of individuals and families, and the particular families of the detainees who are coming back this evening. What an amazing achievement by everybody involved. I think it would be fair to also thank the Iranians, the new Iranian government, for their role in this as well. Could my right honourable friend confirm whether there are any lessons that we need to learn about dual nationals and advice given to them in travelling not just to Iran but to other countries? And could she also confirm whether the agreement that she's reached with her Iranian counterpart provides some form of pathway for other British detainees in Iran eventually to return to?
Well, of course, we will look to make sure that our travel advice, and we always make sure our travel advice is as good as possible. And when I met my Iranian counterpart in September, I was very clear that there are key bilateral issues that we needed to resolve, namely the detainee issue, also the IMS issue. And of course, we don't agree with Iran on many topics. We're not naive about the situation in Iran, but we need to absolutely make sure we're protecting our British nationals. That is my top priority, and that is what I will continue to work to do.
Tulipson.
Mr. Speaker, after 6 years, I can mention Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe in the chamber and not beg for her release. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 8 urgent questions and countless debates, it's a pleasure to finally be standing here and talking about her. And this wouldn't have happened without the Foreign Secretary and the member for Braintree. So can I say thank you from the bottom of my heart, and to all the FCO officials who I know worked tirelessly to make this happen. So thank you. I also wanted to thank Redress, Gibson Dunn, Change UK and Amnesty International and other organisations and individuals who worked so hard to release Nazanin. And can I thank all the MPs on behalf of Richard Ratcliffe, who texted me just before I stood up to say thank you across the chamber, because whichever side of the House you were in, you worked hard. Everyone worked hard to make sure that Nazanin was released. So whichever party, whichever member, wherever, whichever constituency you represented, thank you, and thank you from Richard Ratcliffe as well, including all the MPs who visited Richard when he was on both his hunger strikes. And to the community, especially in West Hampstead, where Nazanin's home is, thank you for always coming and supporting us. But most importantly, I want to pay tribute to my constituent, Richard Ratcliffe, for his relentless campaigning, but I also think he's really set the bar high for all husbands across the world. Can I say to Nazanin, welcome home after 6 long years. And can I say to Gabriella, this time, Mummy really is coming home. And I'll finish by asking the Foreign Secretary, who I am very, very grateful to once again, could she update us a bit more on why Murad Tabas wasn't allowed to leave Iran? He actually lived in my constituency as well when he was in the UK. So I'd like to hear an update on that.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her tireless campaigning and also her patience in the last 24 hours. She and I have had a number of conversations, and it was only when we heard that the wheels were up in Tehran that we really knew it was happening. And I was just extremely concerned to make sure that Nazanin and Anousheh had really been able to leave Iran, and I'm so delighted that we are going to be able to welcome them home today, and the family is going to be able to welcome them home today. And she is absolutely right about Richard and Gabriella and the other families who've campaigned so tirelessly. And it's been an incredibly difficult time. And she's also right to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the Minister for the, he's now Minister for the Middle East, Europe, Russia, because he's so talented and gets so much done. But, my honourable friend has held countless meetings as well to make sure this happens. It's not been an easy process. On the subject of Murad Tabas, the real issue is that he is a tri-national, and that is seen in Iranian eyes as also meaning that the US are involved, and we are working very closely with the US. We have secured his release from prison. Of course, we want to see him come home, and we will continue to work to achieve that with our US partners.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate my right honourable friend and indeed all the team at the Foreign Office and the legal team, who I know will have worked extremely hard, and to everybody, including honourable members, for their tireless work. Can my right honourable friend assure me that in our adherence to the international rules-based system, by paying the debt that it was adjudged we owed to Iran, we shall not swaver from our belief that the arbitrary detention of nationals of whatever country is wrong, and that we must redouble our efforts if we are to effectively defend the international rules-based system that she and I know is under unprecedented attack.
Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend is right that arbitrary detention is completely wrong. We are stepping up our efforts together with our G7 colleagues to work more closely together to challenge that type of behaviour internationally. And I think over the Ukraine crisis and the abhorrent invasion of Ukraine by Russia, you have seen the international community step up and democratic nations work together. And we are determined to address all of those issues, including the issue of arbitrary detention.
We now come to the person who mentioned every Thursday, Valerie Vaz.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Foreign Secretary for all her work, and her Minister, who answered all the urgent questions, and all the officials at the FCDO throughout the 6 years. I know my honourable friends, the members for Hampstead and Kilburn and Lewisham East, are delighted to get their constituents back, but none more so than the Radcliffe family, the wider Radcliffe family, who we all met on Richard's hunger strike, and Anousheh's family. They're pleased to get them back. And Murad Tabas, actually his birth certificate, which I've seen, was born in Hammersmith, so I hope we can make extra efforts. But I'd like to ask the Foreign Secretary if she will ensure that Mehran Raouf, even though he may not have asked for help, that he's not forgotten. But, Mr. Speaker, this was House business, and the House is delighted that Nazanin and Anousheh are back in the loving arms of their family.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I can assure the Honourable Lady that every single British national who is unfairly detained overseas is on our minds, and we are working to see them released.
Catherine Fletcher.
Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary has rightly received many plaudits for the work that her and her teams have done. And the people of South Ribble have been writing to me since I was first elected in 2019, urging her and her team to strain every sinew in difficult circumstances. It's not often that they can all go home from work putting that smile on that little girl's face. So will she join with me in saying thank you from South Ribble and for their efforts?
Well, this has been a team effort, and as we've said, we've seen incredible fortitude and stoicism from the families, from those detained in Iran themselves, and of course all of our constituents who are so deeply concerned about the terrible plight that Nazanin and her family have faced.
Samuel Wilson.
Speaker, and can I also add my congratulations to the Foreign Secretary for her tenacity and determination in resolving these particular issues. I hope she shows the same tenacity and determination in resolving the issues which affect Northern Ireland as well in her negotiations. I'm sure, I didn't know the families. I met Nazanin's husband once outside the Foreign Office when he was conducting his hunger strike. And he told me of the ups and downs and the hopes being raised and dashed continually. And I'm sure that the work which the Minister has done and her officials has given great help to the families who now have their loved ones released, and hope to those who still are looking forward to having their families released. I know that the Minister had to link these two things together, but has she any concerns that linking the payment of money to the release of these hostages might send out the wrong signal to criminal regimes across the world who have no hesitation in using humans in this way?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, to answer the Honourable Gentleman's first point, I will not give up until I have fixed the Northern Ireland Protocol. I can absolutely assure him. Of that. And these issues that are long-standing issues with Iran have been treated in parallel. I have been very clear, the government has been very clear, that this is legitimate debt that the UK government should pay. And that is right, and that is what we have done, and we have found a way of doing that despite the various sanctions regimes that are in place, and we have made sure that it is spent on humanitarian support.
Theo Clark.
Mr. Speaker, it is excellent news that 3 British nationals have been released from Iranian prisons today. I met Richard-Ratcliffe, Nazanin's husband, several years ago at a reception hosted by you, Mr. Speaker, in this place to hear directly of her plight in detention. So I'm delighted that she has finally been released and is on her way home. So can I firstly congratulate my honourable friend for all her work, but also ask her to confirm that her department will continue to support other British nationals in Iran who have also asked for our help.
Foreign Secretary.
We will continue to support British nationals in Iran, and all of the families have been provided with consular support from our officials, and I'm very proud of the support that they have offered. But of course, we will continue to work to make sure that those unfairly detained are able to return home.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, this is brilliant and excellent news, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for the statement she's made today and congratulate the members for Lewisham and Hampstead and Kilburn for the work they put in. Could she give us any indication of when she expects Mehra Tabaz to actually be released? Because being on furlough is not a very satisfactory situation. Obviously, he has the right to return to this country as do others. She mentioned that she can't name all the dual nationals or British nationals being held, and I understand that. But one in particular, Mehran Rouf, a labour rights activist, has been clearly publicly named by Amnesty International and Redress. And is on apparently a long-term prison sentence. Could she tell us what efforts are being made to secure his release? And also, in this changed relationship we now have with Iran, which is welcome, will there now be a robust human rights dialogue with Iran? Because detention of foreign nationals is appalling, but also there are many other human rights issues that deserve and must be raised with Iran, and I hope this will be the start of a serious dialogue which hopefully will improve the human rights of everybody.
Well, on the subject of the individual that the honourable gentleman names, I do have to respect the individual's request of whether or not their case should be raised in public, and that is why we only mention publicly those individuals who've asked to be named. But of course, we continue to supply support to all British nationals who have been unfairly detained. And as I said previously, there are many issues over which we do not have agreement with Iran, but I will continue to talk to the Iranian Foreign Minister and work with the Iranian Foreign Minister to make sure we do resolve issues between us that pertain to the British national interest.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
This news is like sunshine on a rainy day. Congratulations to all involved. Would you agree with me that particular tribute needs to be made to Sayed Badir and the Omani government, who are establishing themselves as interlocutors and mediators par excellence in the region? And would she say what assurances she has got that the IRGC will simply not replace Nazanin, Anousheh, Murad with other dual nationals? And will she reiterate her warnings to dual nationals who may fall within the Iranian jurisdiction that they should tread very carefully indeed?
Foreign Secretary.
Minister Bader and the Omani government have been incredibly helpful in assisting us with this issue, and I want to pay tribute. They flew the detainees out to Muscat. I've been in regular touch with Minister Bader since I first met him in December last year, and they have been instrumental in making that happen. And they are true friends of the United Kingdom. The honourable gentleman is right in what he says about dual nationals, but fundamentally we need to change the incentives on the system so people can travel freely without fear of unfair detainment.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. May I join other members in thanking the Foreign Secretary, her officials, my two honourable friends and everyone who has brought this wonderful day to pass, made all the sweeter by the smiles that we see looking down on us from the gallery. The Foreign Secretary said that the debt was paid in parallel, but we all know that for the government of Iran, it was always sequential. And given what she said about the work she's doing with other G7 members, including Canada, to try and deal with this, what practical steps is she hoping to secure through this to ensure that in future it is much, much more difficult for governments to engage in hostage-taking for political purposes?
Well, the right honourable gentleman is right that we do need to change the practice of countries detaining other countries' nationals unfairly, and that is precisely what we are working on with our Canadian counterparts and others. But we need to act in concert to change the system and change the reactions that we give overall. But I can't say more at this stage, but I hope to be able to say more soon.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is a day of great joy and relief, not just for those flying home today, but also for their families, some of whom it's wonderful to be joined by today, but also for the wider families, including members of the Zaghari-Ratcliffe family who live in my constituency. I pay huge tribute to all involved, including, of course, my right honourable friend and honourable members who sit opposite who've done such a tremendous job on behalf of their constituents. There will be many lessons wrongly drawn from this sad episode. Can I suggest to my right honourable friend there's one lesson that could be correctly drawn? The fact that these people were imprisoned in Iran is the fault of the Iranian regime. The difficulties that the UK government has faced repaying the IMS loan are also the fault of the Iranian regime, because they largely relate to sanctions imposed upon the Iranian regime. Is this a lesson of wider application in the world today, that if you find yourself subject to international sanctions, you will find there are long and expensive consequences?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very effective point about sanctions, and what we are seeing today in Russia, the fact that the government of Russia is struggling to finance its appalling war in Ukraine, the fact that people are struggling to secure the goods and services that they had become used to, and the country has been returned to something akin to the Soviet era, shows that sanctions do work and are effective.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The joy and relief will be felt by all of our constituents who've been fully behind Richard Ratcliffe and the families in terms of getting their loved ones home. Given that there has been a solution in plain sight, which the Foreign Secretary has been able to use today, does she agree that it should never again take 2 hunger strikes, the terms of 3 Prime Ministers, 5 Foreign Secretaries and 5 Ministers for the Middle East to get a solution for people in this situation in the future?
This is an issue that the Foreign Office has been working on tirelessly for many years. Given there was a new government in Tehran last summer, given there was an opportunity to reset the relationship and to start working on these issues afresh, we took that opportunity, but we were only able to do it because of the tireless work of Foreign Office officials. It is not easy, as my right honourable friend pointed out, to be able to pay the IMS debt in the current scenario, and we did find a way to do it, and I'm very pleased that we have.
Simon Hall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The plaudits that my right honourable friend is receiving today are richly deserved, and she and the other ministers and officials deserve the warm applause of the House. She has said she can't go into all the details about the humanitarian aid, but can she assure us that that would be humanitarian aid which Iran will spend within country? Because the definition of humanitarian aid will change. We know that Mr. Putin is calling for allies in the Middle East to help him in his humanitarian work in the Ukraine, and we need to make very certain that those sums are not deployed in that arena. And whilst I've got her attention, as she has a magic wand to solving very long-standing problems, can she now turn her attentions to Libya and redress for those victims of IRA terrorism from Libyan-sponsored atrocities?
I can assure the my honourable friend that the definition of humanitarian aid in this agreement is certainly not the definition of humanitarian aid that Vladimir Putin would subscribe to.
Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know the joy my constituents of Lewisham West and Penge will be feeling at today's news, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for her work. I had the privilege of meeting Richard Ratcliffe when he was on hunger strike last winter. His dignity, courage and resolve was humbling, but I recall his frustration over delay after delay after delay. A mother and their child should never be separated for all these years. The Foreign Secretary must ensure that lessons are learned so that, as she says, this never happens again. And I'll be grateful for her comments as to how she intends that to happen.
Well, we are all very, very pleased that the families are able to be reunited. I mean, in dealing with this issue, and I've been working on it since I became Foreign Secretary in September, there are a lot of complexities, and there are difficulties in working given the sanctions regime, given the process that needs to be gone through, and hours have been put into the